The Winchester's brutal crack split Tuesday morning's silence like divine judgment. Clara Brennan's knuckles went bone-white against worn leather reins as her freight wagon lurched sideways on the rutted prairie road wheels grinding against tracks carved by countless supply runs to Conrad Dietrich's gold extraction works. The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted across the endless Dakota grassland, mixing with dust and the metallic taste of fear that coated her tongue like pennies. "Faster, girls!" Clara shouted, snapping the reins with desperate precision, born from childhood memories of her father teaching her to handle spooked horses during Pennsylvania thunderstorms. Her two bay mares strained against their harness hooves, thundering against hardpack that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Behind her, wooden crates rattled like dice in a gambler's cup, flour beans mercury flasks for Conrad's gold amalgamation process, and the leather-bound ledger that would either free her or damn her to Conrad Dietrich's particular brand of justice. But this wasn't just about Conrad's corruption anymore. As lead balls whistled past her head close enough to part her fair hair, Clara felt the ghost of her father's voice echoing across 15 years. "Clara, girl, when powerful men steal from honest folks, someone's got to stand against them no matter the cost." Her father had stood against such men, once railroad barons who'd used legal corruption to steal their Pennsylvania farm for a depot site. It had cost him everything: their land, their livelihood, their lives. Now history was repeating itself on different ground, and Clara Brennan was determined to write a different ending. 3 more shots cracked in rapid succession. She risked a backward glance and cursed under her breath at what she saw: 4 mounted men gaining ground, fast, their horses fresh, while hers had been hauling freight since dawn broke over Willow Springs like a crimson warning. The lead rider's rust-colored beard caught sunlight like flame. Rusty Joe McCarran, Conrad's chief enforcer, raised his Winchester Model 1873 carbine with practiced ease. Behind him rode Hatchet Harry Kowalski, a mountain of scarred flesh, whose reputation for creative violence stretched across 3 territories, and 2 other gunmen Clara recognized from Conrad's ever-expanding payroll. Another shot exploded. This time the lead ball punched through her wagon's side planking with a sound like splitting kindling. A flour barrel burst in a white cloud that coated Clara's simple blue calico dress and momentarily blinded her. Meal powder filled her mouth, gritty and bitter, reminding her of the last handful of cornmeal her mother had pressed into her hands before the fever took her. The leather ledger pressed against her ribs through the cotton binding cloth she'd wrapped around it. Every bribe, every forged land claim, every payment to corrupt territorial officials, all documented in her own careful copperplate handwriting. 8 months of Conrad's illegal schemes to divert the Ash River from Lakota fishing grounds and struggling homesteaders downstream, all to feed the massive hydraulic sluices and mercury amalgamation tables that separated gold from Dakota Territory ore. Clara had discovered the hidden ledger 3 nights ago while working late in Conrad's general store, updating inventory records for shipments of mercury and other chemicals essential to his gold extraction operation. But it wasn't curiosity that had driven her to search for evidence. It was the memory of her father's final words, spoken as their Pennsylvania farm burned around them. "Don't let the bastards win, Clara, girl. Promise me that." She'd spent Sunday night copying key entries by lamplight, then Monday gathering courage to steal the original when Conrad rode out to inspect his gold works. Now Tuesday's sun climbed toward noon, and Clara's desperate gamble had turned into a race for her life, a race she was determined to win. Thunder rumbled across the prairie, not from storm clouds, but from something far more dangerous. To her right, a massive herd of Texas longhorns crested the ridgeline, their 6-foot horn spreads glinting like polished bone. The cattle moved with the purposeful gait of animals spooked by gunfire. their pace shifting from walk to trot to the beginning of a genuine stampede. Clara's exhausted mares couldn't outrun both pursuit and cattle. Her current course would carry her directly into the path of 2,000 head of panicked beef, each animal weighing more than her entire wagon. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. But then she heard her father's voice again. "Think, girl. Use your head. There's always a way out if you're clever enough to find it." From the rise above the cattle, a lone horseman appeared like something from a fever dream. Clara's first thought, another of Conrad's men circling to cut off her escape. But as the rider descended the slope with fluid grace, she realized this was no hired gun. The man rode bareback on a paint horse, his long black hair streaming behind him like a war banner. He wore buckskin pants decorated with intricate beadwork, and a cotton shirt dyed the deep blue of prairie evening. Even from 100 yards, Clara could see the controlled power with which he managed his mount, every movement, deliberate, economical, deadly efficient. But there was something else in his bearing. A subtle stiffness to his right side that spoke of old injury and carefully managed pain. Clara's keen eye, trained by months of watching Conrad's operations for signs of weakness or deception, caught the slight favoring of his right leg, the way he held his shoulders to compensate for some unseen burden. The stranger reached the leading edge of the cattle herd and seemed to assess the entire situation in one sweeping glance. Without hesitation, he spurred his paint toward Clara's wagon, uncoiling a braided rope from his saddle horn as he rode. Behind her, Rusty Joe's voice carried clearly over the growing thunder. "Damn Redskins getting involved. Harry put a bullet in him." But the distance was too great for accurate shooting from horseback, and Hatchet Harry's carbine shot went wide by yards. The stranger on the paint horse closed the gap with breathtaking speed, his rope already singing through morning air. The loop settled around Clara's left mare's neck with perfect precision. The sudden sideways pressure caused both horses to veer sharply left, away from the approaching stampede, but toward a cluster of prairie dog holes that pocked the ground like miniature craters. "Hold tight," the stranger shouted in accented English, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern that surprised Clara. Most men she'd encountered treated her as either property to be protected or burden to be managed, but this warrior's tone held something different: respect, perhaps even recognition of a fellow fighter. Clara gripped the wagon's side rail with both hands as the vehicle tilted up on two wheels. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it might right itself, but then the left rear wheel caught in a burrow and the wagon went over completely. Clara hit hard ground with bone-jarring impact that drove air from her lungs. But 15 years of her father's training took over. He taught her to fall properly after she'd been thrown from their old plow horse, and those lessons saved her now. She rolled with the fall, protecting the wrapped ledger even as scattered freight exploded around her. Flour and beans painted the grass white and brown, while bolts of cloth unfurled like colorful banners. Mercury flasks, cushioned in wooden crates, remained intact, a small mercy that prevented deadly contamination of the crash site. The stranger's horse skidded to a halt in a shower of dirt and pebbles. Up close, Clara could see he was perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered complexion of someone who lived entirely outdoors. Sharp cheekbones and dark eyes held intelligence, and something else, a deep well of pain that seemed to echo her own losses. When he slid down from his paint horse, Clara glimpsed the full extent of his old injury through a tear in his buckskin pants. The scar on his thigh was extensive, puckered and white with age, the kind of wound that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than battlefield accident. "Can you run?" he asked without preamble, helping Clara to her feet with surprising gentleness. His English was clear, but carried the distinctive accent of the Plains tribes. And beneath his calm exterior, Clara sensed carefully controlled fury that matched her own rage at injustice. Clara clutched the precious ledger against her chest and nodded, though her left shoulder blazed with pain from the fall. She could taste blood where she'd bitten her tongue, and her practical leather shoes felt loose, probably damaged in the crash. "I can run," she said, meeting his dark gaze directly. "And I can fight." Something in her tone, the complete absence of feminine helplessness, the grim determination that spoke of someone who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear, made the warrior study her more carefully. Most white women he'd encountered in frontier settlements were quick to scream or faint at the first sign of violence. This one stood straight despite obvious injuries, her blue eyes hard with resolve that reminded him painfully of his own wife's courage in the face of approaching cavalry. The sound of approaching horses reminded them both of immediate danger. Rusty Joe and his companions had closed to within 50 yards, but seemed wary of getting too close to an armed Indian who'd already demonstrated uncommon skill. "You the one been scouting our range?" Rusty Joe called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Got brass showing yourself in daylight redskin." The stranger, Tokala, though Clara didn't know his name yet, said nothing. Instead, he drew his Colt single-action Army revolver with fluid efficiency, then checked the cylinder's load. 6 bullets. Standard for a gun that had revolutionized frontier justice since 1873. But Clara noticed the way his hand trembled slightly as he gripped the weapon. Not from fear, but from some deeper pain that went beyond physical injury. Clara studied his profile and saw something that both surprised and moved her, not just competence, but genuine anguish carefully buried beneath warrior stoicism. This man had lost someone important, someone whose memory drove him to protect others, even at the cost of his own safety. "I'm not like other women," Clara said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The words came from some deep place inside her, the place where her father's teachings lived alongside her own hard-won wisdom. "I don't scream, I don't faint, and I don't give up. I can handle myself in whatever's coming." Tokala looked at her with sudden, sharp attention. In her declaration, he heard an echo of another voice, speaking different words in his own language. "I will not run my husband. If death comes for our children, it must go through me first." The memory struck him like a physical blow, but also filled him with unexpected hope. Perhaps this white woman could be trusted after all. "That's why I want you," he replied, meaning he wanted her as an ally in the coming fight, but also recognizing something deeper, a kinship of souls who had both paid the price of standing against evil. He pulled a knife from his belt and handed it to her traditional Lakota craftsmanship with a razor-sharp steel blade and beadwork handle. "Stay behind the wagon. Use this if you must." Clara tested the knife's weight and balance. The weapon felt natural in her hand, awakening half-forgotten memories of helping her father butcher hogs back in Pennsylvania, and darker memories of the night their farm burned, and she'd promised herself that she would never again be helpless in the face of evil. "What about you?" she asked, noting the way he favored his injured leg. "I make them keep their distance." Tokala moved to flank their attackers, using the overturned wagon as mobile cover. Each step sent fire through his old wound, but he ignored it, as he'd learned to ignore all pain since the morning his world ended in gun smoke and screaming. Rusty Joe's patience finally snapped. He spurred his horse forward, raising his carbine as he rode. "Conrad wants his property back, girl. Come easy or we make it real hard." Tokala's Colt spoke first, not to kill, but to send a message. The bullet creased past Rusty Joe's hat brim and spooked his horse into rearing. The animal nearly unseated its rider, buying precious seconds as the other gunmen spread out to surround their quarry. Clara found herself moving without conscious thought, circling the wagon's far side to stay out of crossfire, When Hatchet Harry tried to ride up on Tokala's blind side, she threw the knife with surprising accuracy learned from childhood games of mumble-type-egg with her father. The blade embedded itself in Harry's saddle horn, causing his horse to shy violently from the unfamiliar object. The brief distraction gave Tokala the opening he needed. His second shot shattered the stock of Harry's Winchester, rendering it useless. But the effort cost him his old leg wound, made his movements slower than they should be, and Clara could see him gritting his teeth against remembered agony. River Tokala called, catching her eye and jerking his head toward the cottonwood line that marked the Ash River's course. Running water meant better cover than open prairie, and the spring runoff would mask their scent from tracking dogs, if Conrad was smart enough to bring them. Clara didn't argue. She gathered her torn skirts and ran, keeping low, as more shots cracked behind them. They reached Tokala's paint horse, and he boosted her up behind his saddle before swinging into position himself with obvious pain. The well-trained animal responded instantly to leg pressure, carrying them toward the trees at a full gallop. Behind them, Clara heard Rusty Joe shouting orders to his men, but the Longhorn stampede had scattered pursuit horses in all directions. It would take considerable time to regroup and give chase. As cottonwoods closed around them, Clara allowed herself one backward look at the chaos they'd left. The cattle had overrun Conrad's men completely, forcing them to take shelter on a low mesa, while 2,000 head of irritated beef milled around below. For the first time since discovering Conrad's hidden ledger, Clara felt like she might actually live to see another sunset. But she also understood their troubles had barely begun. Conrad Dietrich controlled more than just the sheriff and town council. He controlled the very idea of law and order in this part of Dakota territory, all in service of his gold extraction empire that poisoned rivers and corrupted governments with equal efficiency. Tokala's village lay hidden in a natural oxbow 3 miles north along the Ash River, sheltered by ancient cottonwoods, whose massive trunks could stop rifle bullets. Clara had never been this close to a Lakota community, and she studied everything with intense curiosity as Tokala led her between traditional lodge structures, trying to understand these people who had become unwilling victims of Conrad's grand design. 20 buffalo hide dwellings arranged in a careful semicircle with brush shelters for summer cooking and crafts. Women worked at hide-scraping frames or tended fires where stew pots bubbled with fish and wild vegetables. Children played between the lodges with carved wooden toys or practiced archery with miniature bows. Men sat in shade repairing weapons or crafting tools from bone antler and riverstone. The people watched Clara with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. But no one challenged Tokala's decision to bring her here. Clearly, he held respected position within the community scout, translator, and bridge between two worlds that grew more hostile with each passing season. But Clara noticed something else. In the way they looked at Tokala, a kind of careful gentleness, the way people treat someone who has suffered a profound loss and might break if handled roughly. It made her wonder what tragedy had carved those lines of pain around his dark eyes. The white woman works for Conrad Dietrich. An elderly woman said in heavily accented English, her voice carrying suspicion and old grief. His gold works poison our fishing waters. Our children grow sick from mercury in the river. She brings evidence of his crimes, Tokala replied firmly. She risks her life to see justice done. Clara understood then the full scope of Conrad's environmental destruction. His gold extraction operation didn't just divert water, it contaminated everything downstream with mercury runoff from the amalgamation process. The traditional Lakota way of life depended on clean water for fishing and gathering, and Conrad's industrial methods were slowly poisoning an entire ecosystem. Tokala's own lodge stood slightly apart from the others, positioned where he could watch both river approaches and prairie access routes. Inside, Clara found herself in space that was surprisingly comfortable. Despite its primitive appearance, sleeping robes laid over woven grass mats, personal belongings arranged with obvious care weapons maintained to perfection. But what struck her most was what was missing. No feminine touches, no evidence of family life beyond Tokala himself. This was the dwelling of a man living alone, and Clara's intuitive mind began to piece together the story of his old wound and careful isolation. "Your shoulder needs immediate attention," Clara observed, noting dark bloodstains spreading across his shirt's intricate beadwork. Tokala nodded grimly, settling onto a sleeping robe with obvious relief. Rusty Joe got lucky with that shot. Bullet grazed deep, but it's not mortal. Clara had learned basic medical care from her mother back in Pennsylvania, enough to clean and stitch simple wounds properly. But as she helped Tokala remove his shirt, she realized she was seeing the physical evidence of a much larger tragedy. The angry red furrow where Rusty Joe's bullet had gouged his shoulder blade was nothing compared to the map of scars that covered his torso. Below the fresh wound, she could see the extensive damage to his right thigh, and just a single injury, but multiple wounds that spoke of deliberate torture or massacre. Most telling was a scar directly over his heart, a puckered star that could only have come from a close-range pistol shot. Someone had tried to execute this man and failed, leaving him alive to carry whatever burden had carved the permanent grief into his features. 2 summers passed. Tokala said quietly, noticing her examination. His voice carried weight of carefully controlled anguish. "Blue coats came at dawn to our winter camp. Said we were trespassing on white man's land, that we had to move immediately to the reservation." Clara found clean cloth and water, beginning careful wound cleaning while she listened. Something in Tokala's tone warned her that this story would be difficult to hear but necessary to understand. "My wife Winona was heavy with our first child. She could not travel in winter cold without risk to both their lives." Tokala's hands clenched into fists as he continued. "When I tried to explain to the soldiers, their captain said Indian lives were worth less than cattle, and cattle had to move when white men decided." Clara's hands stilled in their work. She was beginning to understand the true cost of Conrad's empire building, the human price paid for each acre of legally acquired land. "The shooting started when Winona stepped between the soldiers and our lodge. She said if they wanted to move us, they would have to kill her first." Tokala's voice broke slightly. "So they did. Shot her down like a rabid dog, then turned their guns on anyone who protested." Clara felt tears stinging her eyes. "How did you survive?" "Played dead after taking 3 bullets. Laid in bloody snow for 2 days before my cousin found me and dragged me to safety." Tokala's dark eyes met hers directly. 23 people died that morning, including Winona and our unborn son. The official report said we attacked first, that soldiers acted in self-defense. Now Clara understood the careful way his people treated him, and the isolation of his lodge, the deep well of pain that drove him to protect others. Tokala was a man living with survivor's guilt, carrying the weight of everyone he couldn't save. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I know what it's like to lose everything to powerful men who think laws don't apply to them." Something in her tone made Tokala look at her more carefully. "You speak from experience." Clara finished bandaging his shoulder and sat back on her heels. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she found herself ready to share her own story with someone who would truly understand. "My father owned a small farm outside Pittsburgh. Nothing fancy, but it was ours, bought and paid for with honest work." Clara's voice carried its own weight of old grief. "A railroad company wanted our land for a depot, but Father refused to sell. Said the price they offered wouldn't buy half what the farm was worth." "What happened?" They found other ways. Suddenly, our property taxes tripled. The bank discovered irregularities in Father's loan paperwork. Local merchants stopped buying our produce. Clara's jaw tightened with remembered anger. Every official Father appealed to had already been bought. Within 2 years, we lost everything. Your parents died of fever the winter after we were evicted. We were living in a one-room shack with no proper heating, no decent food. They got sick and just gave up. Clara stared into the lodge's dim light. Father's last words to me were, "Don't let the bastards win, Clara girl. Promise me that." Tokala was quiet for a long moment, understanding now why this white woman had risked everything to bring down Conrad Dietrich. They were kindred spirits, both carrying the weight of the dead and the responsibility to prevent others from suffering the same losses. "The man who shot you today works for Conrad Dietrich." Clara continued, her voice hardening with purpose. "So does Hatchet Harry, and probably dozen others like them. Conrad's been using the same methods that destroyed my family, legal corruption, backed by violence when necessary. I know Conrad's methods intimately." Tokala's voice carried bitter personal experience. His men came to my aunt's fishing camp last spring. Said she was trespassing on white man's land that riverbank belonged to him by territorial law. They burned her family's shelter and drove them from water their people had used since the grandfather's time. The mercury from his gold works had already killed most of the fish, but we still needed access for gathering plants and clean drinking water. Clara felt a chill of recognition. That incident's recorded in the ledger. Every bribe, every forged document, every payment to men like Sheriff Lucas. Conrad's been purchasing land that doesn't legally belong to him and selling water rights to his gold extraction operation. White law says man can own water like he owns horse, Tokala observed. Some white law, Clara corrected firmly. Territorial government in Yankton has specific regulations about water access, especially for established communities and treaty lands. Conrad's been bribing officials to ignore those protections, just like the railroad company ignored property rights back in Pennsylvania. She finished her medical work and looked directly into Tokala's eyes. I worked for Conrad 8 months. Kept his books hauled freight between his properties, wrote correspondence with territorial officials. I thought I was helping legitimate business until I started seeing patterns that reminded me of what happened to my family. Why work for such a man if you suspected wrongdoing? Clara's expression darkened with remembered desperation. Because I had no choice. I came to Willow Springs with nothing, no family, no money, no connections of any kind. Conrad offered work and shelter when no one else would even speak to me directly. An unmarried woman traveling alone isn't exactly welcomed with open arms in frontier society. Tokala studied her face in the dim light. And now your situation has changed. Now I have proof of systematic criminal activity that goes far beyond what happened to my family, and I mean to see justice served. Clara's voice carried absolute conviction. There's a federal circuit judge who travels through Crow's Landing monthly. If I can get this ledger to Judge Harrison, Conrad's empire crumbles completely. Before Tokala could respond, urgent voices outside interrupted their conversation. A middle-aged woman ducked through the entrance, speaking rapidly in Lakota, with obvious distress. Tokala's expression darkened as he listened, and Clara sensed catastrophically bad news, even without understanding specific words. Riders approaching from South Tokala translated tersely. At least dozen men with badges and legal authority. They're asking about stolen property and white woman fugitive. Clara felt her stomach clench with dread. Sheriff Lucas leading them? Most likely. With proper territorial warrant, Conrad can search anywhere he chooses. Tokala moved to gather his weapons and essential supplies, despite his injuries. We leave immediately. As they prepared hasty departure, Clara caught glimpses of the village mobilizing around them with practiced efficiency. Women gathered children into lodges, while men checked weapons and took defensive positions along the perimeter. These people had obviously dealt with unwelcome visits from white authorities many times before. But Clara could see the fear in their faces and the knowledge that any encounter with federal law enforcement could end in massacre. An elderly man approached Tokala, speaking in low, urgent tones. From his bearing and the deference others showed him, Clara guessed he held leadership position war chief or tribal elder. After brief exchange, the man gripped Tokala's arm and nodded toward Clara with what might have been approval. He says, "Trust your judgment about the white woman," Tokala explained as they prepared to slip away. He also says, "You have warrior's eyes, brave spirit that doesn't surrender to evil." They left through riverside willows, moving carefully to avoid obvious tracks. Behind them, Clara could hear approaching horses and shouted commands as Sheriff Lucas's posse reached the village outskirts. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed loud enough to give away their position, but Tokala's woodcraft kept them invisible in the gathering shadows. 20 miles south in Ashford, Marshal Davies paced his office with growing concern. Tom Miller's weekly supply report was 3 days overdue, unusual for a man whose punctuality had become legendary among territorial freight handlers. Miller's Crossing served as crucial way station for legitimate merchants and federal communications alike, and its silence suggested trouble that demanded investigation. Deputy Carson. Davies called to his subordinate, "Take 2 men and ride out to Miller's Crossing first light tomorrow. Tom Miller's never missed a report without good reason, and I don't like the implications." Carson nodded grimly. He'd worked territorial law enforcement long enough to recognize the signs of systemic trouble, and Conrad Dietrich's growing influence had been making honest work increasingly difficult throughout the region. Davies returned to his desk and the stack of reports documenting suspicious activities across his jurisdiction. Too many good people had been disappearing or changing their testimony after visits from unnamed federal agents. Too many land transactions were being approved, despite obvious irregularities. The territory was becoming a spider web of corruption, and Davies suspected Conrad Dietrich sat at its center like a patient predator. Meanwhile, Tokala led Clara upstream along game trails that paralleled the water keeping to soft earth and rocky patches that would make tracking difficult. His intimate knowledge of the terrain was obvious. Every ford, every thicket, every ridge that might provide concealment or strategic advantage. They moved in tense silence for nearly an hour before Tokala finally called halt in dense plum thickets that grew along a sharp bend. Here, they were hidden from casual observation, while still able to watch their back trail for pursuit. "Tell me more details about this federal judge," Tokala said quietly, settling beside her in the undergrowth, despite obvious pain from his injuries. "Judge Harrison represents everything Conrad despises: honest, incorruptible, completely committed to territorial law, regardless of who gets hurt." Clara shifted position to ease pressure on her injured shoulder. "He's already investigated several major land fraud cases and sent corrupt officials to federal prison. He's the one man in the territory Conrad can't buy, threaten, or intimidate. This ledger provides sufficient evidence for conviction." Clara nodded emphatically. "Names, dates, exact payment amounts, everything needed to prove Conrad's been systematically defrauding both territorial government and federal Indian agency. There are entries showing regular payments to Sheriff Lucas for special enforcement services and substantial bribes to land registrar in Yankton." Most damning are the Mercury purchase records that show he's been buying far more than his gold extraction process requires. The excess is being sold illegally to other mining operations without proper environmental controls. How do we reach Crow's Landing without capture? Clara had been thinking about this problem since stealing the ledger. There's a trading post called Miller's Crossing about 15 miles east of here. The proprietor, Tom Miller, sometimes carries passengers south in his supply wagons. More importantly, he has every reason to help us. Why? Conrad tried to buy his land last year for railroad access to his gold works. When Miller refused, some of Conrad's hired men burned his barn and poisoned his well with mercury runoff from upstream operations. Miller had to dig new well, and rebuild completely cost him most of his life savings. Tokala absorbed this information carefully. You think he'd risk helping fugitives? If we can convince him we're working to bring Conrad down permanently, yes. Miller's Crossing is also isolated enough that Conrad's men might not think to watch it immediately. They were interrupted by distant sound of dogs barking, not the playful yipping of village pets, but the deep, purposeful baying of tracking hounds following scent trails. Tokala's head came up immediately, his expression alert and deeply concerned. Lucas brought professional trackers. We have maybe 2 hours before they pick up our trail from the village. Clara felt her heart sink toward her boots. Human pursuit could be evaded through careful route selection and superior knowledge of terrain. But tracking dogs presented entirely different challenge. Is there anywhere they can't follow? Running water breaks scent trails temporarily. Rocky ground leaves minimal sign. Tokala was already moving, gathering his gear with practiced efficiency despite his wounds. There's crossing place upstream where we can reach other side without leaving obvious tracks. They resumed flight, immediately moving faster, despite increased risk of detection. The Ash River ran high with spring melt from distant mountains, and the current was strong enough to be genuinely dangerous for inexperienced swimmers. The river crossing proved treacherous beyond anything Clara had experienced. The water was shockingly cold and moved with tremendous force, threatening to sweep them downstream toward rapids she could hear roaring in the darkness. Her sodden dress became impossibly heavy, dragging at her limbs, but Tokala's strong grip kept her anchored as they fought their way across. On the far side, they huddled together in the darkness, sharing warmth and checking that the precious ledger had survived its oilcloth wrapping. Behind them, they could hear the distant sound of dogs and men following their trail, but the river would buy them precious time. On Miller's Crossing lies due east. Tokala said, wringing water from his long hair. We can reach it by dawn if we push hard. Clara nodded, though every muscle in her body ached and her shoulder throbbed with renewed pain. Then we push hard. Conrad won't give up, and every hour we delay gives him more time to close the net around everyone who might help us. They set out across rolling prairie under a canopy of stars that seemed impossibly distant. Clara had never been so aware of her own mortality or so determined to make her life count for something greater than personal survival. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded into the night. Ahead lay Miller's Crossing and the hope of sanctuary with a man who had his own reasons to hate Conrad Dietrich. Neither Clara nor Tokala could have imagined that their destination would become the site of their greatest test, where trust and betrayal would meet in a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone Conrad's greed had touched. Dawn was breaking gray and cold across the prairie when Clara and Tokala finally saw the buildings of Miller's Crossing, rising from the grassland like a mirage. The trading post consisted of a substantial log house, several outbuildings and corrals that spoke of legitimate business conducted with travelers and local ranchers. Clara felt a surge of hope as they approached. Tom Miller had always seemed like a decent man during her occasional business dealings in Willow Springs, honest, hard-working, the kind of frontier merchant who treated all customers fairly regardless of their race or social standing. "Something's wrong," Tokala said quietly, his warrior instincts picking up subtle signs that escaped Clara's observation. "What do you mean?" "Too quiet. No smoke from morning cooking fire, no movement in the yards. Place like this should be busy at dawn." Tokala studied the buildings with growing concern. "And there fresh horse tracks, but no horses visible. Someone's been here recently, but tried to hide their presence." Clara felt a chill of apprehension, but desperation overrode caution. They had nowhere else to turn, and Conrad's pursuit couldn't be far behind. "We have to try. Maybe Miller's just being careful because of Conrad's threats." They approached the main house cautiously, Tokala's hand resting on his revolver grip. The silence that greeted them felt oppressive, loaded with tension that made Clara's skin crawl. Tom Miller emerged from his front door as they reached the porch, and Clara's heart sank at what she saw. The man who had always carried himself with quiet dignity now looked haggard and frightened. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes darted nervously, and his usual welcoming smile was nowhere to be seen. "Alt." "Miss Brennan," Miller said, his voice strained with barely controlled emotion. "Didn't expect to see you out this way, and with company." Clara noticed how he avoided looking directly at Tokala, how his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. This wasn't the confident businessman she remembered, but a broken man operating under tremendous pressure. "Mr. Miller, we need your help." Clara began, but something in his expression stopped her cold. Behind his obvious fear, she caught a glimpse of something else: guilt, shame, and the desperate look of a man caught between impossible choices. "Now come inside," Miller said quickly, glancing around the empty yard with nervous energy. "We can't talk out here where anyone might see us." The interior of Miller's house told a different story than his words of welcome. Clara's trained eyes, sharpened by months of managing Conrad's complex operations, immediately noticed details that didn't fit. An expensive rifle leaning against the wall, far too costly for Miller's modest circumstances. Fresh mud on the floor near the back door, despite the lack of recent rain. Most telling of all, a child's doll dropped behind a chair, as if someone small had been hurried away quickly. "Where's your daughter, Mr. Miller?" Clara asked quietly, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. Miller's face crumpled slightly before he regained control. "She's visiting her aunt in Yankton. Has been for weeks now." But Clara could see the lie in his eyes, and suddenly she understood everything. The expensive rifle, the nervous behavior, the child's toy hastily hidden but not removed. Conrad hadn't just threatened Tom Miller. He'd taken something precious to ensure cooperation. "Mr. Miller," Clara said gently, "where is Sarah, really?" At the mention of his daughter's name, Miller's careful composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he collapsed into a chair, the weight of his impossible situation finally overwhelming him. "He has her," Miller whispered. "Conrad took my little girl 3 days ago. Said she'd stay safe as long as I did exactly what he told me to do." Tokala moved instantly to the window, his warrior instincts screaming warnings. "What did he tell you to do?" "Keep you here until his men arrive." Miller's voice broke completely. "He said if I helped you escape, he'd hurt Sarah. She's only 8 years old. I won't let him hurt my baby girl." Clara felt the trap closing around them like ice water. Conrad had anticipated their desperate flight, predicted their need for allies, and turned their sanctuary into a carefully prepared snare. How long do we have? Takala asked grimly, checking his weapons. They should be here within the hour, Miller admitted. Rusty Joe and at least 6 others. Conrad wanted you taken alive if possible, but he didn't seem particularly concerned about your condition when you arrived. Clara's mind raced through their limited options. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and trapped in an isolated location with enemies approaching from multiple directions. But surrender meant death not just for them, but for everyone else Conrad considered a threat. There might be another way. Clara said suddenly, an idea forming based on her knowledge of Miller's legitimate trading operations and her father's practical education. Mr. Miller, you still have that shipment of supplies in your back warehouse, don't you? Materials for the mining operations and ranches. Miller nodded, confused by the seemingly random question. Including coal oil, sulfur powder, and dry goods. Yes, but I don't understand. Clara turned to Tokala with grim determination. My father taught me how to make smoke signals for calling help during emergencies on the farm. We don't need a bomb, we need a curtain. What about Sarah? Miller asked desperately. If I help you escape, Conrad will kill her. If we don't escape, he'll kill her anyway. Clara replied bluntly. Men like Conrad don't leave witnesses, especially inconvenient ones. Your daughter's only chance is for us to succeed in bringing him down completely. The truth of her words hit Miller like physical blow. He'd been clinging to the desperate hope that cooperation might save his daughter. But Clara's bitter experience with powerful men's methods forced him to confront reality. What do you need me to do? Miller asked quietly. Before Clara could answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the morning silence. Through the windows, they could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions. Conrad's men were arriving faster than expected and in greater numbers. Too late for elaborate plans. Tokala said grimly, taking position at the front window. We fight from here until we can reach the warehouse. Clara moved to the back window, her heart hammering as she counted riders. At least 8 men, all heavily armed and spreading out to surround the house. This wasn't going to be a gunfight, it was going to be a siege. Miller. Rusty Joe's voice carried clearly across the yard. Send them out now and we'll make this quick. Keep playing games and we'll burn you out. Miller looked at Clara and Tokala with anguish written across his face. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry for all of this. You're a father protecting his child, Clara replied. No one blames you for that. But now we need you to help us save her. The first shot shattered the front window in explosion of glass and wood splinters. Clara pressed herself flat against the wall, clutching the precious ledger as gunfire erupted from all sides of the house. Conrad's men weren't trying to take them alive anymore. This was meant to be an execution. They're not giving us chance to surrender. Tokala observed grimly, returning fire through the broken window. His shot was carefully aimed, and Clara heard someone cry out in pain from the yard. That's because Conrad can't risk us testifying even if we were captured. Clara replied, understanding the situation's true dimensions. He's committed now. Either we die here or he goes to prison. Miller huddled in corner of his own home, completely overwhelmed by violence that had invaded his peaceful existence. The warehouse? How do we get there without being cut down? Clara studied the layout through the back window. The warehouse stood perhaps 30 yards away, connected to the house by a covered walkway that offered some protection. But gunmen were positioned to rake it with crossfire. We need that curtain first, Clara said firmly. Mr. Miller, do you have any way to create a distraction at the front of the house? Miller thought desperately. There's a hay wagon near the barn. If it caught fire, it might draw their attention. Perfect. Clara turned to Tokala. When that wagon goes up, can you give us covering fire while Miller and I reach the warehouse? Tokala assessed their desperate situation with warrior's pragmatism. How long do you need? 5 minutes to create something they'll remember. Another volley of shots peppered the house, and Clara could smell smoke. Conrad's men were trying to burn them out. Time was running short, and their options were disappearing rapidly. Miller slipped out through a root cellar entrance, belly crawling toward his barn, while Tokala kept the attackers occupied with carefully placed shots. Clara gathered materials she'd need, remembering her father's lessons about creating dense smoke to drive insects from grain stores. The hay wagon erupted in flames with a whoosh that drew immediate attention from Conrad's men. In that moment of distraction, Clara and Tokala sprinted across the exposed ground toward the warehouse bullets, kicking up dirt around their feet. Inside the warehouse, Clara found herself surrounded by the materials of frontier commerce, barrels of coal oil, sacks of sulfur powder for blasting operations, and most importantly, several bales of damp hay that had been stored improperly. "Help me drag these bales together," Clara commanded, her father's voice echoing in her memory as she began arranging materials for maximum smoke production. "And find me something to use as kindling." Miller worked with desperate efficiency, understanding that his daughter's life depended on whatever plan this remarkable woman had devised. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying as Tokala held off increasingly aggressive attacks with his dwindling ammunition. Clara built her fire, carefully dry kindling at the base, then layers of damp hay that would smolder rather than burn cleanly. Over this, she poured liberal amounts of coal oil to ensure sustained burning, and then scattered sulfur powder throughout the mixture to create the thick, choking smoke she needed. "When this lights off, it's going to fill the entire area with smoke too thick to see through," Clara warned Miller. "The sulfur will make it choking and unpleasant, but not deadly. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before it disperses enough for them to see clearly again." "What about Tokala?" "He'll know what the smoke means when he sees it." Clara hoped she was right about that, but there was no time for detailed coordination. Outside, she could hear Rusty Joe shouting orders for final assault. Clara lit her improvised smoke generator with a lucifer match and grabbed Miller's arm. "Run." They burst from the warehouse as the hay mixture ignited behind them in a great billowing cloud of tar-dark smoke. The coal oil accelerated the burning, while the damp hay created massive volumes of thick, choking vapor that rolled across the trading post like fog. The sulfur powder added its own contribution, a noxious, eye-watering component that sent Conrad's men stumbling away from their positions, coughing and cursing as they tried to maintain their attack through the chemical haze. Through the chaos, Clara saw Tokala emerge from the house like a ghost materializing from smoke. His warrior training served him well as he moved through the confusion, taking advantage of reduced visibility to reach the horses Conrad's men had left tied behind the barn. But the smoke that concealed them also made coordination impossible. Clara found herself separated from both Miller and Tokala, stumbling through the acrid haze with tears streaming from her burning eyes. A hand grabbed her arm, and she spun around, expecting capture. Instead, she found Tom Miller, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes blazing with newfound determination. "Mo this way," Miller shouted over the chaos. "Tokala's got the horses ready." They fought their way through the toxic smoke toward the sound of nickering horses. Clara's lungs burned and her eyes streamed, but she forced herself to keep moving. The ledger was still safe in her arms, and as long as she protected it, their desperate gamble might still succeed. Behind them, the warehouse fire spread to other buildings as wind carried burning embers. Clara realized they'd created more destruction than intended, but Miller's expression showed no regret as his trading post burned. "Home is where Sarah is," Miller said grimly as they reached the horses. "Everything else can be rebuilt." They found Tokala waiting with 3 horses already saddled and ready. His face was blackened with smoke, and there was fresh blood on his shirt, but his eyes held grim satisfaction. Rusty Joe won't be following anyone for a while," Tokala reported. And Hatchet Harry decided retreat was better than charging into poisonous smoke. They mounted quickly and spurred their horses away from the burning trading post. Behind them, Conrad's surviving men were regrouping, but the dense smoke would keep them disorganized for precious minutes. "Where do we go now?" Miller asked as they put distance between themselves and the destruction. Clara looked back at the towering pillar of black smoke rising from what had been Miller's crossing, a smoke signal visible for miles across the prairie. Then she looked forward at the endless grassland stretching toward distant mountains. Ashford, Clara decided. "It's our only remaining option, and that smoke will bring help." "That's 40 miles through open country," Tokala pointed out. "And now Conrad knows exactly where we're heading." Clara gripped the ledger tighter and urged her horse forward. "Then we'd better ride like our lives depend on it." Because they did. Sarah Miller's life and the future of Tokala's people, and the memory of everyone Conrad had destroyed, all of it, depended on reaching federal authority before Conrad's web of corruption could eliminate the last witnesses to his crimes. 20 miles south, Deputy Carson was leading his small patrol toward Miller's Crossing when the massive column of black smoke appeared on the northern horizon. The smoke was too dense and too dark. For any normal fire, it spoke of chemical accelerants and possible violence. "That's not a house fire," Carson told his men grimly. "That's a signal for help or evidence of a major attack. Change of plans, we ride hard for the nearest fort and bring back cavalry. Whatever's happening at Miller's Crossing is beyond what 3 deputies can handle." They wheeled their horses south toward Fort Randall, where a full troop of cavalry could respond to what was clearly a territorial emergency. Deputy Carson had no way of knowing that his decision would ultimately save 3 desperate lives. But his years of frontier experience had taught him to recognize the signs of serious trouble. The ride to Ashford stretched through the longest day of Clara's life. 40 miles across open prairie under blazing sun, pursued by enemies who knew the country better than they did, driving horses that were already exhausted from their escape through the chemical hell of Miller's Crossing. Tom Miller proved himself a different man than the broken father they'd found that morning. Freed from the paralyzing fear of Conrad's immediate threats, he rode with grim determination and an intimate knowledge of the terrain that proved invaluable. His daughter was still in Conrad's hands, but now he understood that their only hope lay in complete victory over their tormentor. "There's a way station about 10 miles ahead," Miller called over the thunder of hoofbeats. "We can water the horses and check our back trail." Clara nodded, though speaking was becoming difficult. The sulfur-laden smoke at Miller's Crossing had seared her throat and lungs, leaving her voice barely above a whisper. Beside her, Tokala rode with the endurance of his warrior ancestors, but she could see the cost of their desperate flight in the lines of pain around his dark eyes. The way station proved to be an abandoned cabin beside a reliable spring, the kind of shelter that had saved countless travelers over the years. They watered their horses and themselves, then climbed to the cabin's roof to scan the horizon for pursuit. "There," Tokala said grimly, pointing toward a dust cloud perhaps 5 miles behind them. "At least 6 riders moving fast." Clara felt her heart sink. Even with fresh horses, they couldn't outrun Conrad's men indefinitely. At some point, they would have to make a stand, and the odds would be heavily against them. "How much farther to Ashford?" she asked Miller. 25 miles, but the last 10 are through broken country called Widow's Gap, where horses can't move fast. Miller studied the approaching dust cloud with experienced eye. "They'll catch us before we reach town, unless something changes the situation." Clara looked at the precious ledger in her hands, then at the two men who had risked everything to help her bring Conrad to justice. She was about to suggest splitting up when the sound of distant thunder reached their ears, not weather, but the organized drumming of many horses approaching from the south. "Cavalry!" Miller shouted, his voice cracking with emotion and hope. Someone sent cavalry. Through the heat shimmer of afternoon air, they could see them, a full troop of federal cavalry riding north toward the smoke signal of Miller's Crossing, with weapons drawn and guidons flying. At their head, Road Marshal Davies himself, accompanied by the commanding officer from Fort Randall, and enough military firepower to end Conrad's rebellion permanently. They saw the smoke, Clara realized. Our smoke signal brought help. The cavalry reached their position just as Conrad's pursuit came into rifle range. What followed was less a battle than a rout. Conrad's hired guns, faced with federal troops and legitimate authority, threw down their weapons and surrendered without firing a shot. Rusty Joe and Hatchet Harry, their clothes still reeking of sulfur smoke, were taken into custody along with the others. But Conrad himself was notably absent from the group. Marshal Davies dismounted and walked directly to Clara, his weathered face grave with understanding of what she'd endured. "Miss Brennan," the marshal said formally, "Deputy Carson reported seeing your smoke signal. We came prepared for the worst, but it seems you've handled most of the situation yourselves." Clara handed him the ledger with trembling hands. "Everything's in there, Marshal. Every bribe, every forgery, every crime. Evidence of Conrad Dietrich's entire operation, including his illegal mercury sales and environmental destruction." Davies opened the ledger and scanned several pages, his expression growing darker with each entry he read. "This is more than sufficient evidence to clean up territorial government completely. Where's Dietrich himself?" "Probably at his gold works," Miller said. "He's got my daughter Sarah there as hostage. Please, Marshal, she's only 8 years old." "Already handled," Davies assured him with grim satisfaction. "We hit his operation an hour ago based on information from other sources. Found your daughter and several other children he'd been using as leverage against their parents. She's safe and asking for her father." Miller collapsed to his knees, overcome with relief and gratitude. Around them, federal marshals were securing Conrad's captured men and taking their statements as evidence. "What about Conrad?" Clara asked. "Tried to run when he saw us coming," Davies reported. "Didn't get far. His horse threw him into a ravine about 2 miles from his gold works. Broke his neck in the fall. Conrad Dietrich won't be terrorizing anyone else ever again." Clara felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. After all their struggle, all the danger and sacrifice, Conrad's end had come through simple accident rather than justice in a courtroom. But perhaps that was fitting. Evil men often destroyed themselves when their schemes finally collapsed. "Is it finished?" Clara asked quietly. Davies nodded slowly. "Conrad's network is broken. His foremen and overseers are under arrest. The territorial government is already seizing his properties to compensate his victims." The marshal looked at Tokala with respect. "Your information about the environmental damage will be crucial for the federal investigation. The mercury contamination alone will take years to clean up, but at least it's stopped now." Judge Harrison arrived in Ashford 2 days later, accompanied by federal prosecutors and environmental specialists. The territorial courthouse was transformed into the center of the largest corruption investigation in Dakota Territory's history. Clara's testimony formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. For 3 full days, she walked investigators through the ledger page by methodical page, explaining each entry's significance and legal implications. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. Conrad's entire empire had been built on systematic fraud that touched every level of territorial government. The environmental assessment was equally damning. Federal specialists found mercury contamination extending for miles downstream from Conrad's gold works, poisoning fish populations and groundwater that Lakota families had depended on for generations. The cleanup would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take decades to complete. But at least the active contamination had ended. Tom Miller was reunited with his daughter Sarah in an emotional scene that brought tears to harden Marshall's eyes. The little girl had been well treated during her captivity, but the trauma of separation from her father would take time to heal. Miller vowed to rebuild his trading post in a location far from any mining operations where Sarah could grow up safely. For Clara, the end of Conrad's reign marked the beginning of an entirely new life. Judge Harrison offered her a position with the territorial government, investigating corruption and environmental crimes throughout Dakota Territory. Her experience with Conrad's methods, combined with her meticulous attention to detail, made her uniquely qualified for such work. There are other Conrad Dietrichs operating throughout the territory, Harrison explained. Men who use legal corruption and environmental destruction to build personal empires. The federal government needs investigators who understand these methods and have the courage to confront powerful criminals. Clara accepted immediately. She had found her true calling, not just seeking justice for her own family's destruction, but protecting others from similar fates. Tokala was offered a parallel position as special investigator for Indian affairs, focusing on environmental crimes that affected tribal lands. His knowledge of both Lakota culture and white legal systems made him invaluable for bridging the gap between communities that rarely understood each other. My people need advocates who can speak both languages, Tokala explained to Clara as they prepared to take their separate paths. Someone who understands that protecting the land means protecting everyone who depends on it. 6 months later, Clara stood in the territorial courthouse in Yankton, presenting evidence in another major environmental crime case to a federal judge. A copper mining operation had been dumping arsenic-laden waste into streams that supplied drinking water to 3 different communities, and Clara's investigation had uncovered the same patterns of bribery and legal corruption that had enabled Conrad's crimes. Word reached her regularly that Tokala's people were prospering in their restored homeland along the Ash River. Federal environmental specialists were working with tribal elders to restore fish populations and clean up mercury contamination, while new water quality regulations prevented future industrial pollution. Tom Miller had rebuilt his trading post in a location carefully chosen for its distance from any mining operations. Sarah Miller was thriving under her father's watchful protection and had announced her intention to become a federal marshal when she grew up. Like the people who saved me from the bad man. Clara had kept her solemn promise to see justice done, but discovered something far more important in the process. She had found work that honored both her father's memory and her own commitment to protecting innocent people from predators who wore masks of respectability. The ledger that had started everything was now permanently preserved in federal archives, its pages serving as evidence of what could happen when good people found courage to stand up against systematic corruption. More importantly, it had become the foundation for new laws protecting both environmental resources and the communities that depended on them. In her modest apartment above a general store in Yankton, Clara maintained a small shrine to their shared adventure. Tokala's eagle feather, a photograph of Judge Harrison, a newspaper clipping detailing Conrad Dietrich's death, and the subsequent cleanup of territorial government, and a daguerreotype of Sarah Miller smiling beside her father at their new trading post. Most precious of all was a letter that had arrived just that morning, written in the careful English script Tokala had learned years before. Clara, the river runs clear and strong, and my people grow stronger each day. Your courage gave us back our heritage and hope for tomorrow. The mercury is gone from our water, and children can safely play in streams their grandparents fished. We will never forget your sacrifice or the price you paid to see justice done. Sarah Miller sends her love and says she wants to be a lawman like you when she grows up. The ghosts that followed me have finally found peace, and I think yours have too. When cottonwood leaves turn gold this autumn, look toward the north and know that friends are thinking of you with gratitude. May your trail be straight and your burdens light. Tokala. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it with her other treasures. Outside her window, the busy streets of Yankton filled with settlers and traders officials and merchants, all pursuing various dreams in the harsh but promising landscape of Dakota territory. Tomorrow would bring new cases to investigate fresh corruption, to expose different battles for environmental protection, to fight. Clara Brennan was ready for all of it, armed with hard-won wisdom and unshakable determination, to honor the memory of everyone whose lives had been destroyed by greed disguised as progress. She had learned during that transformative week, with a Lakota warrior and a desperate father, that she was indeed not like other women. She was stronger than she'd known, braver than she'd imagined, more committed to justice than she'd ever dreamed possible. That knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead, and the memory of friendship forged in desperate circumstances would remind her that even in the darkest times, courage and honor could prevail against overwhelming odds. Her father's voice echoed one final time across the years. Don't let the bastards win, Clara girl. They hadn't won. Thanks to three unlikely allies who'd found each other in the crucible of crisis, justice had triumphed over corruption, environmental protection had replaced industrial greed, and honest government had begun to take root in territory that had known too much darkness. Clara Brennan settled at her desk to review tomorrow's case files, confident that her father would be proud of the woman his teachings had helped create. The bastards would never win. Not as long as people like her and Tokala and Tom Miller and Marshall Davies stood ready to fight for what was right. The West was still wild, but it was becoming a little more just with each passing day.